Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us this week on Have You Heard, Armor Animal Health's video series. This week we're going to be talking about goats and pneumonia and why it's so common in goats. My name is Ellice. I've been with Armor since July, but I've been in the animal health industry for over 12 years. Armor is lucky enough to have some amazing veterinarians on staff. This week, we're welcoming back to the show Dr. Vicky Lauer. She's been a star on the Have You Heard show in the past, but for those of you tuning in for your first episode, let's have Dr. Vicky introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Vicky Lauer. A little bit about me, just a little preface too. I live out in the middle of nowhere. My internet has been a little sketchy lately, so if there are some glitches, we do apologize ahead of time. It's my fault. But anyway, I'm from Missouri originally. I was born and raised there and then moved to Wisconsin when I graduated from veterinary school over 9 years ago. I live in central Wisconsin with my husband, who was a farmer. I have 5-year-old twins, and then I do have a small herd of purebred registered Nubian dairy goats that I milk by hand twice a day, every day. Now, I personally do not show them, but they are show quality. So that's my kind of initial and definitely at-home experience with goats.
Perfect. Well, before we begin, I wanted to let our viewers know that if you guys have any questions throughout today's presentation, just type them in the comment section. We'll get to your questions after the presentation is over. And then if you're watching the recorded version of this, you are still welcome to post any questions, and then we'll certainly get back to you with an answer. Along with questions today, we are looking for the best goat jokes you guys have. So let's see who should be a comedian in another life. We'll be giving out an Armor Animal Health sweatshirt to the best question or goat joke that comes in. So Dr. Vicky, having goats yourself, you're probably an expert on this topic from a personal and professional level. So I've heard goats come down with pneumonia pretty often. Is it a common occurrence?
Yes, unfortunately, goats do commonly come down with pneumonia. So there are several studies out there that have shown that in adults especially, pneumonia is the second leading cause of death, which is really just following after Clostridia. And then also in kids, I don't know of any good study, but at least from my personal experience and what I've seen, pneumonia is the second leading cause of death in those kids as well, following diarrhea, which is fairly similar to what we see in cattle too.
Okay, so why is pneumonia so common in goats versus other animals?
Yes, so unfortunately, goats are fairly small. They have fairly small lungs compared to their body size. So if you think of a horse, which was designed, to race and run, our ruminants, they're really not designed to do anything besides just eat and lay down and chew their cud and sleep. So they don't have very large lungs. And because of that, they are more susceptible to pneumonia. Goats also are more sensitive to ammonia and then humidity that's in the air and in the bedding as well. Because they're shorter than cattle, that means they're closer to the ground, they're closer to the bedding. So then they're breathing in more ammonia with every breath they take, unfortunately. And then goats have a lot more ammonia in their urine as well. So it's kind of this perpetuating cycle where, yep, they're more susceptible to ammonia and thus pneumonia. And then they're making more ammonia in their urine. The other issue I see a lot of times with goats and goat dairies is that a lot of goats are just kind of shoved willy-nilly into any existing facility. A lot of these places are old dairy cow barns that they remodel somewhat for the goats. But because they're not specifically designed for the goats, it really doesn't take into consideration the extra ventilation needed to keep those goats healthy. So in those old cow barns, I'll just see it where they rip out the stanchions and then just kind of have the whole thing as a bedded pack for the goats. Old heifer barns, they'll rip out the stalls and then just kind of let the goats roam wild in there. The issue with a lot of those barns is they're often completely enclosed. For some barns where they do have curtains on the sidewalls, most of the time the curtains are closed too tight and the sidewalls are too high because those goats are a lot shorter to the ground. if the sidewalls are 4 feet high, any fresh air that comes in just goes straight over the top and doesn't actually get down to the level of the goats. The other issue I see are barns that are heavily insulated, which is kind of a double-edged sword because you want to try and keep those goats warmer in the winter. But if it's highly insulated and there's a plastic liner, then all that humidity is trapped in the barn, and then it actually collects on that plastic liner and then drips down into the barn. And a dripping barn is just kind of the perfect way to set up pneumonia in goats.
Okay, so do you find that there's more cases of pneumonia in the colder months, or do you feel like it's pretty widespread all year round?
It certainly does happen year round, but there's a lot more pneumonia in goats in the cooler months, in the winter, similar to cattle, because usually those animals are all inside and then the barns are closed up pretty tight as well. And part of that is you want to try and keep the water lines from freezing. You want to make it more comfortable for employees who are working with the goats. And then if a farm is kidding year round, just trying to minimize frostbite in those newborn kids or keep those kids from freezing altogether. And then just trying to keep costs down as far as feed goes, because when goats, when they get cold, when it's below 40 degrees outside, goats do have to expend energy to stay warm, which means that they're going to eat more. And so on those places where the barns are shut up tight just to try and keep the barns warmer, again, we see more pneumonia. And then there's just not enough ventilation in those barns that are shut up tight. So the ammonia, the humidity builds up, and it just, again, keeps kind of a vicious cycle working around itself. Where I see the worst pneumonia, unfortunately, is in heated kid barns, because it costs a lot of money to heat those barns. And we want to keep those kids fairly warm. So then kind of the solution is, well, don't bring in much cold outside air. But by not bringing in that cold outside air, then we're not truly ventilating the barn. The other thing I'll see is barns where maybe those goats could go outside during the warmer weather. They will shut off those outside runs, or they'll just lock all the goats inside the barn, again, to keep the barn warmer, which means there are more animals in the barn altogether. They're more overcrowded, which means those goats are producing more urine and thus ammonia that's going into the bedding, more humidity in the barn, and again, causes more pneumonia. And then another kind of risk factor for pneumonia that I see is just barns that aren't cleaned frequently enough. Those bedded packs, which are the most common type of bedding for goats, those bedded packs create a lot of heat, which is great for keeping the barn warm and keeping those animals warmer. But the downside is that that bedded pack is full of ammonia. And so that's going to cause lung irritation in those goats, again, leading to pneumonia.
Okay. Well, for the viewers out there, does anybody have any questions? Let's get those typed into the comments section and we'll see who can challenge Dr. Vicky here. So another question from me is, do you find there's a difference in the type of ventilation that a barn has or a building? So a disadvantage or advantage that would come with, say, a natural ventilation versus a fan?
Yeah, so most of the newer barns that are specifically designed for goats, a lot of them are going to rely on natural ventilation just because it's cheaper, it's easier.
Sure.
You don't have to do much with them because nature basically ventilates the barn. At least that's the theory. So what we typically see for those naturally ventilated barns in the winter is that the curtains are closed up fairly tight. There may be a little bit of a gap at the top just to let some fresh air in. The trouble is goats don't generate very much body heat compared to adult cows. Cows, they're making a lot of heat. If you've been in a cow barn, you can see the humidity and the heat basically coming off of them. And goats are more like calves, where they just don't generate a lot of body heat because they're so small. So because of that, that heat is really what drives natural ventilation in those barns, and it's simply not happening. So in a perfect world, the theory is that cold air coming in through those side walls drops down and then mixes and then the kind of nasty stale air from down below goes out through the ridge top. Because goats don't generate that much body heat, that air really, that cold air coming in from the side, it doesn't drop down to the level of the goats. It just kind of mixes in the barn and maybe goes out the top. Otherwise, it can just kind of stay there. So I've fogged goat barns, and there's really none of that nasty air from down by the goats is being removed. And truly, to ventilate a barn, you need to bring outside air in and replace that nasty, humid, ammonia-laden air that's close to the bedding. Replace that with that nice, fresh air from outside the barn. Now, the lower the ceiling in goat barns, the warmer the barns are going to be. So a lot of the goat barns have a fairly low ceiling, which the downside is that they get pretty hot in the summer. So I have a couple clients where they have, really, really low ceilings, and those can technically do okay with natural ventilation in the winter, but in the summer, it doesn't work at all. So a lot of the goat barns have kind of like a medium height to them. And that higher height means that the barn is just going to be cooler. So then again, it's going to be more difficult to naturally ventilate those barns. Now, there are some mechanically ventilated goat barns. They are more expensive because typically that means you're running fans, usually with some sort of either air inlet or an exhaust fan that's pulling air out. The nice thing is that in the summer, it keeps those goats pretty cool because you got a lot of air moving. But the downside is that in the winter, most of those barns aren't designed for good winter ventilation. And so the fans typically are placed pretty high up, so well above the level of the goats. So when those fans are running, yes, it's moving air, but it's not moving the air close to the goats. It's not moving the air at the level of the bedding. So that's the biggest downside that I see with a lot of mechanically ventilated barns, is that it's those fans, those inlets, those exhaust fans, they're going to be moving out kind of that warmest air sitting well above the goats, but not removing that ammonia-laden air that is sitting near the bedding.
Okay. So what are some common causes of pneumonia, and do you find that it's the same with all species, or is there just is this kind of a special process that goes with goats?
Yeah, so pneumonia in most species, especially our livestock species, it's going to basically be set up by high ammonia levels, so poor ventilation, which allows those lungs to get a little bit of damage. And then the bacteria that are normally in those animals' noses is allowed to travel down into the lungs. Same thing with the viruses. Now, there are some major differences between goats and, say, cattle on the viruses. So for goats, the respiratory syncytial virus is fairly similar to the bovine respiratory syncytial virus, the BRSV. So if you're familiar with that in cattle, yes, it is somewhat similar in goats, but it's not identical. Goats also get what's called caprine arthritis encephalitis virus, or CAE. That can also cause a pretty severe pneumonia, and we don't have a vaccine for CAE, so that one can be pretty devastating in a lot of herds. For bacteria, the main bacterial causes of pneumonia are pretty similar in goats as in cattle. So Mycoplasma, Pasteurella, Mannheimia, those are our three big ones. Now, the substrains are a little different from what cattle have, so the vaccines that are in cattle aren't the greatest for goats. Goats also get caseous lymphadenitis, or CL. If you're a goat producer, you're probably pretty familiar with that term. CL will cause abscesses in the lungs, so you'll get a true pneumonia from CL as well. Then goats will get lungworm, similar to cattle. Not very common just because most of our dewormers work against the lungworms. But then unfortunately, I'll see a lot of aspiration pneumonia in goats as well, especially in kids. Now, this can be secondary to white muscle disease, which is a selenium deficiency that goats are a little more sensitive to than cattle. Also, just from improper tubing. So the farm is tubing those kids at birth, and they're being maybe a little too aggressive. They're kind of drowning those kids. kids who get aspiration pneumonia, saying that they're really leaky nipples, not replacing the nipples often enough, that will cause aspiration pneumonia as well, pretty similar to what happens in cattle and calves.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do we treat pneumonia?
So treatment of pneumonia is pretty similar as what's in cattle. So antibiotics are necessary for the bacterial causes of pneumonia. The trouble is, I mean, even as a veterinarian, I can't always tell what is causing that bacteria or what is causing that pneumonia just by looking at it. So we do recommend that there's some further testing just to try and diagnose what is the specific cause. So for the bacterial causes, we can do a bronchoalveolar lavage, a transtracheal wash. There's some blood testing that can be done for the viruses to rule out lungworms. That they're just basically fecal tests to do. So we do like to, again, do some testing to try and figure out what it is. If the pneumonia is from CAE, there's no cure for that. There's really no treatment for it either. So for that, there's not much we can do. We could throw antibiotics at that animal with CAE for the rest of its life, and we're really not going to be able to cure that animal. But at least initially, we can't just wait a week or a week and a half to find out what is causing that. So I do assume that the pneumonia is bacterial in origin. So I do treat with antibiotics. The only trouble is there's only one antibiotic that is actually labeled for goats with pneumonia, and that is Naxel or Ceftiflex. Now, the nice thing about Naxel or Ceftiflex is that there is no milk or meat withhold, so goat dairies can use that. It works fairly well, but you do need to follow the label directions. There are certainly lots of other antibiotics that we use in livestock that can be used in goats, but they are all extra label, which means that a veterinarian has to have a relationship and have been to your farm and seen your animals before they can recommend which of those antibiotics to use. Now, because those antibiotics are not labeled for goats, it means there's going to be a longer milk and a longer meat withhold than what's on the label. You can't just assume that whatever is on the label for a milk and meat withhold applies to a goat, because it does not apply to a goat. If there's a 4-day milk withhold on there in cattle, for goats we can assume it's going to be several days longer than that, and your veterinarian needs to provide that specific info so you know how long to hold the meat or how long to keep that animal from being slaughtered. Also with goats, they do metabolize drugs faster than cattle because they're more of a browsing species, so they're used to eating a lot of plants, some that are even poisonous. So they've got a lot better liver metabolism. So we do often increase the dose that we give to goats compared to cattle. So yeah, there are definitely some differences there that you need to work with your veterinarian on to figure out which antibiotic to use for your farm. I do want to say kind of one thing, because unfortunately I see it a lot from other veterinarians, is that they will recommend Exenel or Exceed in goats. Because Naxel is labeled for goats and it's in the same drug family as Exenel and Exceed, it's just a slightly different formulation. Legally, we have to use Naxel. There really is no way we can justify the use of Exenel or Exceed. So technically Exenel and Exceed are illegal to use in goats. Again, I know some veterinarians who use it. There is definitely a long milk and meat withhold. And then if anybody ever caught you giving Exenel or Exceed, or a vet giving Exenel or Exceed, it'd be pretty hard to justify. And yeah, there could be some major fines, and the veterinarian could potentially even lose their license. So just don't do it. Stick with Naxel. Naxel works. Baytril is another antibiotic that is 100% illegal in goats. There's absolutely no way we can justify its use. So never ask your veterinarian if you can use Baytril on your goats. The other thing we do for goats that have pneumonia is just some general supportive care. So anti-inflammatories, usually aspirin or Banamine are most commonly used. They're not labeled for goats, so there are going to be longer milk and meat withholds on those, but they are at least options to make those goats feel better. And then just to rule out white muscle disease, we will typically give selenium, vitamin E, and that will help increase the immune system as well. And then just making sure those animals have access to feed and water at all times. So when they're feeling a little better, they don't have to go far to or fight with other animals to get to feed and water.
Perfect. Okay. Well, here's kind of branching off of that is now that we've talked about treatments, how would we go about preventing pneumonia? And would you say it's kind of an overall blanket response again for all species, or is this just more focused towards goats?
Yes, so ventilation, and cleanliness. Those are the biggest things that we can do to prevent pneumonia in goats and other species as well. So the ventilation, again, we are removing that humid, ammonia-laden air that is close down by the goats, close to the bedding, and replacing that with nice, fresh outside air. Now, how to accomplish ventilation, again, naturally ventilated barns are difficult to ventilate in the winter, so typically that means some sort of mechanical ventilation fans. But those fans do need to be correctly placed, so they're closer to the goats, but they're not drafting the goats either. So it's very important if you are wanting to look at your ventilation for a goat barn, work with an expert who actually knows goats. Unfortunately, I'll see a lot of builders who just kind of throw a general ventilation plan onto the building specs. And most of those they're not going to work for goats. A lot of them don't work for cattle either. So work with someone who knows goats and can truly help with your ventilation design. Positive pressure ventilation systems are another option. I have designed them for a few goat farms. They do seem to work well, as long as they are installed correctly and the specs are followed very closely. Now, with any sort of ventilation, when we're bringing that outside air in and it's cold outside, that means the barn is going to be colder. So that might mean requiring some supplemental heat, especially in those kid barns. What I do for my baby goats is I just have dog coats and I put them on the baby goats, and they're super cute for one, but then it's basically acting like that calf jacket for calves. So it provides that extra layer of insulation to keep those kids warm, and then just adding more bedding for those kids as well, something that they can nestle in and stay dry. General cleanliness, cleanliness is next to godliness. That applies to goats and all the other species. Removing that bedding regularly from those bedded packs. And when I say regularly, the best way to determine what is regular for your farm is what's called a knee test. So for the knee test, you go and sit down on your knees in the barn, right where those goats are, and then you put your nose right to the bedding. So you are breathing the same air that those goats are breathing. You stay there for 1 whole minute, so 60 seconds. You'll breathe that air right off of the bedding. If after 60 seconds you get up and you can breathe fine, you're not coughing, your eyes aren't running, you're not sneezing, that air is nice and fresh down there, great. You don't need to clean out that bedding. But if your eyes are running, they're burning, your nose is burning, it's time to remove that bedding. Same thing after you stand up from doing the knee test. If your knees are wet and damp, it's also time to remove that bedding. Simply adding more bedding on top is not removing the source of all that ammonia, and that's what we want to do. We want to remove all that ammonia-laden bedding. So making sure that you just check the bedding regularly, make sure it is clean and dry and doesn't reek of ammonia. For smaller farms where maybe some animals are going to a show and then coming back, or if you're bringing in some new arrivals, it's very important to just practice some general biosecurity as well. So quarantine those animals for 2 weeks, keep them in a separate pen where they don't have nose-to-nose contact, or they're not sharing any feeders or waterers with other goats. Keep them separate for 2 weeks before you do introduce them to the rest of the herd. On the kids side, training employees so they are properly tubing their newborn kids, replacing any leaking nipples, and then trying to minimize CAE and CL transmission by pulling those kids at birth and then feeding them heat-treated colostrum and pasteurized milk. Because again, CAE is that virus that we can do nothing to treat, and we certainly can't cure them. The only thing we can do is try and keep them from getting it in the first place. For lungworms, we want to just use a good parasite control strategy, just like we do for all of our other worms. Now, lungworms do require a snail as an intermediate host, and because of that, it's important to fence off any low-lying pastures, any wet pastures, just to try and make sure that those lungworms don't build up in higher levels. And then most of our dewormers do work on lungworms, so following a deworming strategy, again, with your vet's recommendations. Now, the big thing, of course, in cattle that we do to prevent pneumonia is vaccinate. And like I said, a lot of the bacteria and then one of the viruses, it is the same or similar to what cows get. So there is some talk about maybe vaccinating goats using those cow respiratory vaccines. The downside is that they're not approved, and it's actually pretty highly debated on the veterinary community. So some private practitioners have had pretty good success, especially before going to a show. They use one of the intranasal vaccines on the goats, and their goats are some of the ones who don't actually get pneumonia. But from the research side, so researchers have been able to grow the same bacteria and the same viruses from the lungs of goats who were vaccinated with those intranasal vaccines, and they actually think it was the cause of death. So in general, I don't recommend any of the cow pneumonia vaccines in goats. There is a CL vaccine for goats that could be used just to try and minimize CL, but that also is not one that I typically recommend.
Wow, that's really great information. Thank you, Dr. Vicky. Let's see what kind of questions we have from our viewers now. We've got some good ones. So the first one here I have from Ashley and Aaron, and she asks, is there a certain time of year goats should be vaccinated for pneumonia, which we kind of touched on a little bit just there, but.
Yep. So if you were actually vaccinating your goats for pneumonia, definitely before the show season starts, if you are taking them to show, because that's very stressful on those goats. Otherwise, you could vaccinate in the fall. Again, I don't recommend vaccinating goats in general. That is very much a herd specific thing. Most of my goat herds that I work with, we don't use any of the intranasal vaccines, and definitely none of the injectable vaccines in the goats, but good question.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Ashley, for that. So Carrie has a question. She says, can you place a fan at their level?
Yeah, so in the summer, that's actually what's recommended, is to put a fan at their level and, blow that air. That way you are taking that hot, humid air off of them. The trouble in the winter, though, is we don't want to draft those goats. And most of those fans are creating a pretty strong draft. And we don't want to chill them any more than we really need to. So typically with the winter ventilation, we are going at least 2 feet above the ground so that the air above those goats is nice and fresh, but we're not drafting those goats. But it does depend on the size of the goats as well. That 2-foot recommendation is what I typically do for kid barns. For the adult goat barns, we go a little higher than that for placing the fans.
Okay, that makes sense. So again, from Ashley and Aaron, she asks, what is the best bedding in your opinion? Straw, shavings, raised beds, etc.
Yeah, and that is very dependent on where you live and what you can source. So I personally use straw, and then my goats have a hay feeder, and goats like to waste hay, especially if they're not starving. So honestly, my goats kind of self-bed themselves just from all the hay that they waste. Shavings can be really dusty. So a lot of people will use shavings for the kids in the kid barns. And because of all that dust, you will get more irritation because, it's just dusty. They're breathing in all that stuff, which makes them cough more, and they're a little more susceptible to pneumonia. So it depends on the shavings, the sawdust, on how dusty it is. The sawdust and the shavings, once they get wet, they are really, really wet. So typically you have to clean a whole lot more versus straw. A lot of times it'll let that liquid urine kind of fall down through into the bottom layers. So one option is to do sawdust down as a kind of bottom absorptive layer, and then have straw, or use hay in my case, above that. So that can work pretty well.
Perfect. Okay, so we have another question here from Rachel. She says, can ammonia be at dangerous levels even when you can't smell it, say lying down in the bedding?
So if you are actually lying down at the bedding at the exact same level as the goats, our noses are pretty sensitive to ammonia. So if you can't smell it, there's probably not going to be very much, and certainly not at a dangerous level. Now, there are some ammonia meters that you can get. They're actually not super expensive. And those you can put down, right at the level of the bedding and get a reading from those. So that is an option if you don't trust your nose, but most of the time your nose is pretty sensitive and works quite well. Now, if you're standing up, at an adult level, you're not oftentimes going to smell the ammonia. If you are standing up and you smell the ammonia, then the ammonia levels are very, very, very high down at the level of the bedding. But yeah, if you're at the level of the bedding with your nose basically, right at the bedding, and you're not smelling much ammonia, you're probably fine.
Okay, good to know. So our next question comes from Adam. How much do you think long migration of parasite larvae have to do with coughing in goats?
That's a good question. So there are some parasites that can definitely kind of travel through the lungs. That's not where they ultimately end up. Like the lungworm goes to the lungs, but some of the liver flukes can travel through the lungs. It's not very common though, honestly. It's one of those kind of oddball things that we as veterinarians would consider, but yeah, it's pretty unusual. Good question though.
Okay. And I think, well, we've actually got a nice goat joke on here too. Adam says, not too bad. I like that one. All right, so that's all we have for questions right now. Thank you everybody for submitting those. We really appreciate it. And we hope you enjoyed today's topic. And all kidding aside, we hope you learned something new or useful about how to treat or prevent pneumonia. If you found it useful, please share with your friends. And remember, this video is recorded, so you will be able to go back and view it on Facebook. We also have it on our YouTube channel and our website, which is www.armoranimalhealth.com/have-you-heard. So next week, we are not going to have a show because it's Thanksgiving. So we at Armor Animal Health wanted to wish you and yours a very happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you again on December 3rd with our girls, Gabby and Val. They're going to be talking about holiday gifts for your favorite farmer. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night and a wonderful weekend.